a letter dating back to the early 1700s from Johann Budger, who was an alchemist, and the letter was to the King of Saxony, Augustus the Strong. And therein lies a story. The story of an alchemist. Budger actually was an apprentice to apothecary, but in those days, apothecaries dabbled in alchemy. I mean, all kinds of people dabbled in alchemy at that time, trying to turn metals into gold, including people like Isaac Newton, the famed physicist. He also dabbled in alchemy. Anyway, Budger was bent on trying to make gold, but he didn't have enough investors to foster his activities. So he turned to a little bit of magic. Here's what he did. He had some cups, and he showed the cups as being empty, which obviously they were, and no doubt about that, empty cups. And yet, out of those two empty cups, believe it or not, he was able to produce a gold nugget. Well, that spread his fame. And this is when he sent a letter to the king, and the king invited him. And he set up a laboratory trying to make gold. Well, of course, he was unable to do that. And the king got angrier and angrier and threatened to execute him. And that's when the alchemist hatched another scheme. He said, "It is true, I couldn't make any gold, but I found a way to make white gold." What was that? That's what porcelain was referred to in those days. Porcelain had been first made in China in the 8th century, and it was really a novel thing. Now, to tell you the truth, these are made in China, but they don't date back to the 8th century. But they are porcelain. And Chinese porcelain was much valued in those days because nobody in Europe could reproduce it. But Budger said that he had found a way to do this. And indeed, it turned out to be true, because he had been experimenting with clay, heating it to a very high temperature through a series of lenses that were invented by Christian Huygens, a physicist. Concentrated light, they were able to heat clay to a very high temperature. And he had noticed that when he was carrying out some experiments in his crucibles, he put some minerals in there, and the crucible turned white, like porcelain. So he began to experiment with different kinds of clay, and he found a type of clay that was only found in China called kaolinite, named after the district of China where it was found. And this turned out to be just the right material. When heated to a high enough temperature, he made porcelain. And this became a famous invention, and the king was very happy with that. In fact, he founded a factory in the early 1700s in Meissen in Germany, the first porcelain manufacturing plant. Others around the world also began to produce porcelain by this formula. One of the earliest ones was a company in Hungary called Herendi. And here is one of their most famous pieces. This is based upon a Hungarian folk tale called Matty the Goose Boy. And it dates back to the early 1800s. And it's a story of a boy who was abused by his master, but got vengeance on him. It's a very famous tale, and as you can see, it is really a magnificent piece of porcelain. And there were others also that began to produce porcelain in those days. One of the more famous ones was a company in Bohemia that eventually came to be called Dux Royal. And I do have a piece of that as well, believe it or not. And look at the intricacy here. This porcelain, made in the 1800s. Of course, today it is not to everyone's taste, but it is absolutely fascinating. So next time when you look at your Royal Doulton or your Ladro, or if you are lucky enough to have some Meissen porcelain that dates back to the 1700s, you'll be able to link it to the alchemist who, with his magic, laid the foundations to the whole porcelain industry.